Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the October edition of the Free Press Book Club. My name is Erin Lebar. I am your book club admin, and we'll do a quick round of introductions. So we have Ben Sigurdson, Free Press Books editor, with us. We have Chris Hall, McNally Robinson, and we have our author, Meira Cook. Thank you so much for being here. We'll run this night like we do all of our other meetings. So we will start with Chris's introduction, go into a reading, and then Ben will start the Q&A. If you have any questions, feel free to pop them in the live chat box, which is directly to the right of the video that you're watching, and I will keep an eye on those as best as I can throughout the meeting. And then at the end, we'll talk a little bit about next month's pick. And with that, I will pass it off to Chris.
Thank you, Erin. Hello, everybody. So tonight we talk about Charlie Minkoff, indecisive Charlie, who 13 years after his birth is still full of hope as he faces the full catastrophe of life. So I was struck in reading this novel. Based on the description, I kind of expected a novel that tackled the story of an intersex adolescent to be highly serious. And so I was pleasantly surprised when the first half of the book hummed along with the energy of lightness and humor. It allowed Charlie to be alive in so many normal ways. But Charlie is being challenged by his teacher to write his life story to be the main character in his own story. And he is reluctant to do so. But whether he likes it or not, his personal story runs smack into the high seriousness of religious tradition, and the second half of the book slows down as it deals with the consequences of that collision. This is a novel of concealment and tentative revelations, sometimes biblical revelations. It's a story where mirrors serve only self-consciousness. It's the story of adolescent reluctance, which feels perfectly normal, and yet Charlie's version is uniquely his own. The world doesn't seem to know what to do with Charlie because it's a world that values normal over everything else. He is loved dearly by his grandfather and tentatively by his mother, yet when his body starts developing to its own logic, that love doesn't seem to be enough. I'm glad to have met Charlie. The world is full of infinite possibilities, and novels help us explore and get to know many of those. I'm looking forward to learning more about Charlie and in the process bringing him to life, But before we get to the discussion, I will ask Meira Cook to read briefly from The Full Catastrophe.
That was beautiful. Thank you, Chris. That sums up the novel beautifully. And thank you for inviting me here. I was recently in Vancouver at the Writers' Festival there and found out that writers all across Canada know two good things about Winnipeg. One of which is that we have a wonderful independent bookstore called McNally Robinson, and the other is that we have a newspaper that still publishes book reviews. So thank you so much. It's such a privilege to be here. Those are two good things they know. There's some talk of a windy corner, but I've never been there. So yes, The Full Catastrophe is exactly as Chris says. It's about the relationship between Charlie Minkoff, 13 years old with intersex traits, and his grandfather, Oscar Wolf Minkoff, who is a 90-year-old Holocaust survivor, and who the relationship between the two of them, they are each other's best friends and lifelong confidants. So I thought I'd read from the beginning because that would, there's not too much setup, but it's about the moment when Charlie was born and Oscar was introduced to his grandson, who he loves unreservedly the way we all deserve to be loved. The trouble with Charlie was he couldn't make up his mind. But as his grandfather, Oscar Wolf Minkoff, pointed out, it wasn't the poor kid's fault. Indecision wasn't necessarily a matter of choice. The fact that the doctors were struggling to assign the newborn a gender, to declare an M or an F, was just one more example of vacillation that was surely not, at this early stage, Charlie's fault. The way Oscar told it, Charlie Minkoff came into the world shrieking like a banshee, the proud possessor of 10 fingers, 10 toes, 2 neat ears, a comically snub nose, a well-developed sense of outrage, and a healthy pair of lungs. A tonsure of pale hair stood out around the infant's head like dandelion fluff, and 2 large, slightly protuberant eyes completed the picture. Little frog, his grandfather exclaimed fondly, stroking the baby's cheek. The child was perfect, Oscar thought, sincerely puzzled by the doctor's insistence that something was wrong, gravely wrong. He just needs time to make up his mind, Oscar said. Give the little frog time. That's not how time works, snapped the surgeon, a ghastly man. And then I go on to talk about how Oscar raised his own daughter as a single father. And of course, his daughter, whose name is Jules, is Charlie's mother. Oscar had raised his daughter as best he could, given her perverse nature, her fiercely independent spirit, and her flagrant disregard for convention, all of which Oscar understood was because Jules was an artist, had been since birth. That was how it was, he reflected. You began as you meant to go on. But when he tried to explain this point of view to Charlie's surgeon, the man convulsed with rage, banging his fist into his palm and speaking so emphatically that he bit each word off at the root. Perhaps this was why it took Oscar a moment to realize the terrible man had called his grandchild a ticking time bomb, whose controlled detonation he was willing to oversee, but whose artistic success he could not guarantee. Sarcasm would never be enough for some folks, Oscar reflected. In addition, they had to use finger quotes to express their disgust. In response, Oscar brought up one of his favorite stories, Cat in a Box, as he called it. The short of it was that if a cat got stuck in a box, you could never be sure what was happening in the box until you lifted the lid. Cat could be asleep, cat could be awake, cat could even be, God forbid, passed away. The trick was to let cat make its own decision, with the understanding that whatever happened, the cat could never go against its nature. It could never, for example, become a dog or, here Oscar turned the finger quotes he so resented back upon the surgeon, a bomb. Fascinated by Oscar's highly original interpretation of Schrodinger's thought experiment though she was, Dr. Jabbour felt obliged to intervene. A pediatric endocrinologist, she'd been called in for a consultation and, like Oscar, had taken against the surgeon's harrowing sense of emergency. In the flurry of chromosomal testing and analysis of genital tissue that the surgeon had insisted on ordering, and the ensuing brouhaha about what to do, what choices to make, hers was the voice of reason. The decision is up to the child, she said. I look forward to watching him grow into an extraordinary young person. Or her, she amended hastily. Now here was Charlie, 13 years later, still at 6s and 7s. But despite what Jules had written on the wonder wall, the boy wasn't angry at God or mad as hell. He didn't hate his mother, he hadn't given up on his deadbeat father, and he hardly ever wished he'd never been born. On the contrary, Charlie was hopeful, prone to hope as others are to asthma or allergies. This dogged optimism verged on foolishness, his grandfather sometimes thought. But foolishness, as Oscar knew, wasn't the absence of light. It was the absence out of which the light could be separated from the darkness and the heavens from the earth.
Wonderful, lovely. Thank you so much for reading that passage. It was just a great. I hadn't come back. I had read through the book and read through certain parts and stuff, but I hadn't gone back right to the beginning, and it really sort of tied it all together for me, I think. Do you want to talk a bit about, if you're okay with just jumping right in, about the process of writing this book? I was watching an interview or listening to an interview earlier that noted that some of these characters are around for 5, 6, 7 years. Was that sort of the germination of this book? Is that sort of when it originated, and sort of what was the process like, sort of pulling it all together?
Well, that's a very optimistic way of talking about the process of writing. It's hardly ever, for me, a question of pulling things together. It's more a kind of slog through an imaginative landscape. But I think, and you're right, the process did take 5, 6, 7 years. I think it began for me about, like 30 years ago, at least, when, if not longer, when a friend of mine from home, from where I was brought up in Johannesburg, told me that he had confided in his rabbi that he'd transition, and his rabbi had been hospitable to him. To his surprise and delight, the rabbi had been hospitable and welcomed him into the congregation, but made one rule, which was that he did not want my friend, to read from the Torah, which is in Orthodox synagogue. It is only men are allowed to read from the Torah. Of course, there's many different kinds of Jews, as you see in the novel, and there's many different kinds of ways of being a Jew, from secular to Orthodox. But this rabbi had drawn a line in the sand, and the line was on the side of the law, which said that there is a binary understanding of gender, and that only men can read from the Torah. And I was really interested in this and thought about it for years, because it was a very nuanced approach. The rabbi wasn't saying, no, you're not what you are, what you clearly are. He was saying, yes, you're welcome in the synagogue, you're welcome to sit with the men, because that's what you are, but there is a law that I can't go against. So that was what made me want to explore this subject within the circumference of a law that understands an Orthodox law that says there is a binary understanding of gender, rather than a fluid and more organic understanding, the way that we do understand gender and sexuality and identity now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's very timely. I feel like if this book would have come out, 6-7 years ago, let's say, and you say you were a really fast writer and managed to turn around and what have you very quickly, it would have been almost ahead of its time, I feel like, in that I feel like it sort of culminated, it came at the right time. And one reader noted, well, you already sort of covered the question that they have, but they said it's so timely on a few levels, but gender and identification issues are more relevant than ever among our children and youth, and also noted that it was a very sensitively drawn novel. Obviously, that is not the core focus of the full catastrophe, but it is sort of a component of it on which it hinges, I think, or at least, to kick off a lot of what happens in the book, I would say.
Well, thank you to that reader. I'm very grateful to have that. I did a lot of research about gender and the fluid nature of gender and identity. Read memoirs, histories, books, conference papers, medical papers, which it turns out are very difficult to read. I don't know if any of you have tried to read them, but they're very difficult and needed help with that. But much of that research doesn't make its way into the novel, because I felt that that it would just be replicating the problem to write a deeply, to write about Charlie's intersex traits rather than the full person that he is. In fact, it's the least interesting thing about him, I think, that he is going through a great deal personally and in terms of his adolescent struggles that have nothing to do with, nothing necessarily to do with that. And his mother, who's an artist, and I was so interested in what you had to say, Chris. You said that she tentatively loves him. I like that word. She herself is an artist who she's not able to speak because of an accident that she has in the past, but again, she feels that that's the least important thing about herself. And she in her artistic work, she compares it to, and she does a lot of autobiographical artistic work, and she compares it to, Van Gogh's ear or Toulouse-Lautrec's dwarfism, which is the spectacular thing that we understand if we understand nothing else about, these nuanced and complex artists.
Yeah, I mean, one reader noted that there was a passage, I think, around page 93 or so, which is Dr. Jabour's explanation of the condition that sort of maybe reflected if anything at all, some of the results of your extensive research into having intersex traits or what have you. But yeah, otherwise it doesn't really seem, it doesn't play a continuing factor throughout the novel. It's just sort of, comes up here and there, but otherwise it's more the human element, the overarching sort of relationships between father and or mother and child and grandfather and what have you. We did have one reader sort of ask about why you chose the title, and said, I know she refers to it in the book itself, but I find it negative to refer to the various aspects in life in that way. But I would counter that and say I didn't feel it was negative. I felt it offered a few different ways to sort of interpret these, what goes on in the book, in reference to the teacher's story. There's the reference to the full catastrophe and Oscar's sermon, which I am dying to get to because that was just an incredible part of the book. In Charlie's later reference to the pandemic, there's this sort of almost shifting notion of, what is the full catastrophe?
Well, the full catastrophe is life in all its messy and incomplete and accidental bits, I find it a very accepting way of understanding life. It's catastrophic, and yet it's abundant. So that's really what the title meant. I'm not sure what Ben did I
Yeah, I think that's great. Did sort of a very sort of logistical question. Was it a title that you had sort of early on in the process, or something that just popped out at you?
Oh, wow. It's really interesting. If you're looking at a book, and those of you who are writers know this, everything that's between the covers is something that you as a writer have jurisdiction over. But the cover, the back cover, is something that is a product, really, and so it's more of a committee decision. So I won't really go into the other titles that I had that were not considered the best title, but it's really something that the publisher and the editors talk about, and the front cover is because the publishers are trying to sell a product, and perhaps the author isn't always the best the best arbiter of how to sell their book. But I did like the title very much, and of course I had final say, and I was happy with it.
That was a very diplomatic answer.
It's about stories. The novel's about stories, and so I liked the idea of stories being something that just pile one on top of the other. And there's the story that the stories are used as a way for Oscar to give Charlie courage, to heal him. The one that I read was about the cat in the box, but there are others that he constantly, tries to bolster his grandson with.
Scorpion and the Frog?
Scorpion and the Frog. And that's brilliant because, yes, exactly. Those are the two stories that are holding the book, I think, in two different hands. The one, the cat in the box, is about developing in your own sweet time, however you will, and not being interfered with. And not really having the scrutiny. In fact, scrutiny is the opposite of what Cat in a Box is about. And the Scorpion the Frog, which, I bet you most people know that story. Scorpion jumps on top of Frog's back and says, "Give me a ride to the other side of the river." And the Frog says, "No, you'll sting me, you're a scorpion." And the Scorpion says, "I promise, I will not sting you." And halfway across the river, he stings the Frog. And as they're both going down, the Frog says with his last breath, "Why did you sting me? Now we'll both drown." And the Scorpion says, "I'm a scorpion. I have no choice in this." So that's the opposite. That's a story about not having a choice. It's about, having a determined nature. And I think that you're asked to come into the novel. I hope that the reader makes a choice between those stories, and not necessarily one or the other. There's many stories, and finds their way along the continuum of, developing without scrutiny and having no choice in the matter. But I find them both quite, wonderful stories.
Oh yeah, I was reminded of the Scorpion and the Frog last night when I was with my kids. I was watching the Charlie Brown Halloween special, and there was the part where Lucy is holding the football for Charlie Brown to kick. And it was just like, as I was watching this, I was like, oh my God, this is the Scorpion and the Frog, like playing out in real time.
Yes.
Anyway, Chris, do you have a question you want to
Sure.
jump in?
Well, I wanted to talk about the tone that I described as humorous and light, and it's interesting that you talked about writing being a slog, but because for a reader, it was so easy. Like I was reading quickly, and the sentences really flowed. So a couple of things. One, like, how do you get from the tough slog to that making it look easy, like it felt like to me? And then kind of why did you want to tell at least the beginning of the story in such a way? What did that allow you to say or do, I guess?
Well, I wanted to write, thank you for that wonderful compliment, Chris. I wanted to write about the love between Charlie and Oscar. And as the novel begins with Charlie finding out that because he's doing a school project, he finds out that Oscar Oscar tells him a little bit about his experiences in the Holocaust, and Charlie finds out that Oscar never had a bar mitzvah. And then, out of a sense of wanting to right the wrongs of history and a great love of his grandfather, Charlie decides to get one for him. And so your question was really why write it in this lighthearted manner. It wasn't a choice that I made, it was how the novel came. And I think part of it was that to answer the first part of your question, I didn't mean to say slog in a bad way. Writing is hard work, and I love the hard work of it. But it is hard to make something look easy, and it's hard to write humorously. I was trying to figure out humor as I went along. I read an interview with Nicholson Baker, who writes, amongst other things, he writes sort of literary porn, I guess. And someone asked him, like, is it necessary for you to be aroused in order to arouse the reader? And he said, absolutely. In order to write this stuff, I have to get, I have to be aroused too. I have to get hot. Otherwise, how can I expect the reader to respond? And I was thinking that's the exact opposite of humor, because you can't be, taken up with the joke. You can't, find the joke so funny that you are overriding it, that you are lobbing it too hard. Really, comic writing has got to do with throwing a ball that you hope will be caught. And sometimes it's a balloon, because you want to, throw it so softly. Sometimes it goes wide, sometimes it, doesn't land, but it doesn't have to do with your response as a writer. However hard it is to write, however much you work on it, is not meant to show. So I thank you for saying that it doesn't. I guess the other part of what you were asking was why I felt that it fitted. Well, Oscar's personality is so optimistic and so kind. I always think of that quote from Ben Jonson, via Leonard Cohen, who said, "I've studied in the philosophies and the religions, but cheerfulness kept breaking through." And that's how I think of Oscar, that he's had this very difficult life and has had many times of great stress and trauma, but cheerfulness has broken through, allowed him to get through his life to the point where he stands with his grandson and tries to bolster him, to make him pick up the reins of narrative and be the first person narrator of his own life.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's Brilliant.
Mhm.
And I was going to go into something else, but then the last part that you were talking about, I found a passage on page 185. You write, but try as he might, Charlie could never see himself as anything other than a bit player, a character actor without, strictly speaking, much of a character. What was it like to sort of to extract Charlie from his introvertedness or his feeling that he was not a main player in his own life?
Hmm. Um, well, you just have to, Margaret Sweatman said this so beautifully last month when she talked about how you have to listen. You just have to listen, and I don't know how characters come to you, and it's difficult to talk about because it sounds kind of spooky and a little bit like you're describing ventriloquism or taking dictation, and it's not like that, but it's not unlike that either. So it's just that you have to listen and live with the character and hear what they're trying to say, and sometimes you go in the wrong direction and you have to figure it out as you go. This novel, as most novels by me and by other people, have gone through so many edits and so many rewrites that by the time you sort of write your way into a sense of conviction.
Well, in case, so now I'm going to jump back to sort of where we were a little bit before. I just wanted to hop on that just because we were on that exact topic. For me, a lot of the humor came through in the dialogue and in the conversations, whether it be sort of letters between Mr. Scarrett and Mr. Oslovsky, the emails between Charlie's teacher and Jules, but in particular, the conversations between Oscar and Charlie and Rabbi Spiegelman and Mr. Himmelfarb, sitting around these tables and just sort of like hashing out life and sort of trying to get down to the nitty gritty of it. And, this 13-year-old boy sitting with these three older men, and I thought it, for me, a lot of humor, I think, or the humor that seems the most effortless comes through in dialogue that just seems so real, and that you can just sort of, you can hear the voices in your head when you're reading the book. And for me, with the full catastrophe, that was on absolute display. Like it just really rang true to me, and I could hear each of these characters as I was reading it. And was there a question in there? I don't know. Well, what was the process like sort of hashing out that dialogue, in particular those characters, but some of the thought of including the emails or the letters or and stuff.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a lovely compliment. Thank you so much. Ben is right. The novel is made up of different stories, and emails, letters, biblical exegesis and interpretation, jokes, intertexts like The Wizard of Oz, artist statements. So I have a lot of stories in there, and of course it is a third person narrative. There is an organizing consciousness that takes account of all these stories, and as you read, you become aware whose consciousness that is. But why? So why did I choose to do it through so many different mediums? This is a story of community. It's a story of Charlie and Oscar. That those are the two main characters. But it's also about the Charlie's mother, his absent father, his great buddy Weezer, who's a long distance truck driver,
Dog.
Dog Gelman. Yes, there's a dog in there, so to tell a story about community, I wanted there to be a sense of a kind of roving consciousness, taking account of different points of view. So it couldn't just be one point of view. It had to be, skip about amongst the community. And it was important for me to have all these stories and to write, and because I did see this as a novel about community, about the community, a Winnipeg community, and that as Oscar says to Charlie at many points, that stories heal individual pain, and they heal a kind of community consciousness. And so that's the reason that I had all these different mediums. And it was such fun to write like that, though. I really enjoyed it.
Oh, I'm sure that joy really does come through in the dialogue. Like it was such a joy to read, and I thought to myself many times, like, this would have been so fun to write. Like just to, you know, not either. Obviously, it's not like you just sort of like sit down and bang it out and it's done or whatever. Obviously, there's so many revisions and, you know, sweating over that kind of stuff. But in the end, it did feel joyous. But you were talking about these this sort of omniscient third person perspective, but that in the way that it sort of shifts, and that seems like maybe a good place to jump into the bar mitzvah scene, because you've got Charlie, you've got Oscar, and you've got Rabbi Spiegelman, and it's this sort of slightly extended scene where it just sort of seems to keep jumping back and forth between the three of them, and yet it's the same catastrophe, for lack of a better term. Like, it's the same sort of it's Oscar just sort of delivering his impromptu sermon, and I found that scene so engaging and so fascinating. And I wonder if maybe you could talk a little bit about that scene, because it does feel sort of like one of, if not the most pivotal scene of the book.
Yes. So Oscar is trying to he has to give a sermon about the Torah portion that he gave, and it's the portion about the Egyptians leaving the land, and the different plagues, and he's trying to work out why the plagues are so why God had to say no 9 times before he said yes, and what was the point of the terrible final plague where the firstborn Egyptians are sacrificed. So that played into the idea, the theme that I had all along of sacrifice, and who would sacrifice their children and how you would sacrifice them. And the story of Abraham and Isaac is quite important in this novel, as a reference. And there's a scene in which Oscar interprets the Isaac and Abraham story as one of outrage. Like, why would Abraham do this? Why would Abraham listen to God? He would never do this. He would. The implication is he would never have harmed his grandson Charlie, even if God asked him to. So he's being quite rebellious, and he's being quite indignant about the law. This is part of what I wanted to do, was to write about the law, and yet treat it in some ways with a certain amount of outrage. And the story of Abraham and Isaac is so important to Charlie and to Oscar, because Charlie is in some ways, he doesn't have a father, but he has Oscar, and so part of the novel is about how to find this father that he feels he doesn't have.
And I'm struck at that point because that is a pivotal scene, because humor loses its power somehow in it can't cure everything. So the world forces itself upon Charlie, that the rabbi, you got to choose M or F, or we don't know how to cope with this, and his body starts to develop breasts. He's got to face that, and other than Gelman, who I would propose is also a scorpion, he's got to stay that licking cool no matter what, right? But the second half of the novel I found far more serious, even though there's bits of the humor, but I don't know what question I'm getting at, but the speed, like the sentences, I wasn't reading them as quickly, and the whole feeling of the novel changes. And you were clearly aware of that, but but as a craftsperson, how do you like how aware, I guess, are you at the level of sentence and tone and so on to capture that difference?
It, yeah, I think I was aware of that. I was aware, but it's wonderful to have a really intuitive reader like you bring that out. So okay, I was sworn to secrecy. I was never going to tell the story, but I will break my confidence. So I was writing this novel, and I thought I knew how it was going to end. I had this story in my head, and I was writing towards the ending, and then the ending just didn't work for me. It wouldn't gel. It just felt artificial. So for a long time, I'd say even a year, I was writing in pursuit of an ending. And it was really, although I thank you very much for saying that it was it's a joyful novel, and it did feel joyful to write. That was a kind of difficult time because it really felt like I couldn't finish this novel. I had spent 5 years writing it, but there was no ending. And then, well, I'll come at this from another angle. I was writing, and I had to be very careful because, as you've noticed, there's a lot of different stories and different letters and diary entries, etc. So I had to be very careful about dates. And the last thing you want to do is piss off your editor by saying something happened, on the 13th of February 2019, when, and say that was a Tuesday when in fact it was a Thursday. So I was using a calendar, and just to make life easier, I was writing in a contemporary way. So things, as I was writing, the novel was progressing, and so everything was contemporary. And I thought, well, it's possible that that I will write this into the future, but I don't know what the future will bring. And then I thought, like, what could go wrong? What could go wrong? Well, the first thing that went wrong was that the river, the river didn't freeze that year. One of the pivotal scenes takes place on the Assiniboine River in one of the warming huts that are so beautiful and that I hold so dear, that is such an important part of the city. And every year, this is a pilgrimage. Go along the river, find the warming huts, visit them. And so this was important, but the river didn't freeze right. It was that year, not last year, but the year before, and the river didn't freeze, and we weren't allowed on, and the warming huts didn't. We're all on the banks, and okay, I thought that's okay. I get a freebie. What else could happen? What could possibly happen? Anyway, the novel, the last section. I don't want to give too much away, but just to say that things escalated from March 2020 quite a lot in everybody's lives.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, that's interesting that you talk about the ending, because I mean, I guess I read the bar mitzvah scene and I thought, whoa, that was very intense. Like, it was just I was just so caught up in it, and I thought, there is a scenario where maybe it's just got like a couple pages of sort of like a wrap up, and that's it, and that would have been fine. But I loved the section after that too, the stowaway story, I guess, for lack of a better term, and just following Charlie and Gelman and Wiese in this remarkable journey that sort of does end up wrapping everything up. It was, I guess you sort of answered my question to do with that.
I think you're making a very important point, Ben, which is that, why was this not? It wasn't just a story in search of an ending that was that was somewhat arbitrary. No, because what happened to all of us at the beginning of the pandemic, I think, was that we experienced a time when history collided with the present tense. And this was something that Oscar always knew because he'd lived through the Holocaust. And it was something I had actually that I felt that I had lived through, because I grew up in the 80s in South Africa, and and my memories are of newspaper pictures that are quite devastating, but that disappeared. As soon as they appeared, they disappeared because they were being censored. But that remain in my memory as this time of I'm thinking of the picture in 1976 during the Soweto Rebellion of the one that I'm sure you know of, Hector Peterson, the child who's dead, and he's being carried in his in someone's arms, and while his sister runs alongside. So that felt like I had experienced, not like as a bystander, I had experienced this time where I was aware that history was happening while in the present tense for me, and I realized that my children had never experienced that, because they in fact had done these roots projects that Charlie is asked to do, and then in March of 2020, we all had that experience where these times that were unprecedented and which we didn't necessarily enjoy, but in which we understood what it feels like to watch history, where narrative is sort of running through our veins, and that's why it was an important ending for me.
Mm-hmm. No, that makes perfect sense. I mean, yeah, I think about the beginning of the pandemic, and I think like, when was something else that we might have lived through that was that impactful? And in this Western world, probably you would say like September 11th or something along those lines, right? But yeah, other than that, that's a great way to put it. The sort of history sort of happening in the present, and in a way that I'm sure none of us will ever forget. So, Chris, cool.
Sure. Well,
sorry, I was just checking. I just got a message from Erin. She just sent me a note. Anyway.
Oh. Well, you said that you were writing towards a different ending, and you found this one, and it's wrapped up this way. But like, would you describe yourself as kind of intuiting your way to an ending? Like, is that because the ending felt very real to me when I say that humor lost its power when you described the pandemic? It was hard to laugh through the pandemic too, and in some ways, laughing is part of how we kind of ease our pain, but we don't solve things necessarily that way. And I found the ending very kind of emotional. That here's Charlie facing this crisis, this reality that he can't avoid anymore. So like an ending that's too kind of sewn up where all the threads come together starts to feel unreal, and this one didn't. And I just wonder, like, how do you find your way to an ending when you're wanting to leave it kind of open enough, I guess?
Yeah, well, as I said, like, you make mistakes, as with everything. I've made so many mistakes in writing, and but luckily you can fix them before the novel is published. So that's good. But as I said, like, I was writing, and the ending that I had in mind, and I don't always know exactly where I'm going, but I feel like I know how, that I have a vague plan, but it just wasn't working out. So I could just say, I could either find an ending, or I could, start another novel. What's that Pirandello play, 6 Characters in Search of an Author? This was like a novel in search of an ending, but I feel like I found an ending that, and I'm so glad you think that it works.
Mm-hmm. We did have one question from a reader asking, wanting to know, became so invested in Charlie's life that wanted to know whether there was going to be a sequel.
Doesn't want it to end.
Yeah, exactly.
That's so kind. Wow. That would be a see, I just had this light bulb go. Well, I haven't thought of that, but that would be wonderful. Thank you. Unknown reader.
There you go. Yeah, I didn't get the name down, but Erin might know. And so how quickly?
I have a feeling that Chris wants to talk about Gelman.
Yes, you want to talk?
Yeah, Gelman was the star of the show. I mean,
I
scene
yes,
stealer.
yes, definitely. I mean, definitely injected some much needed comic relief from time to time. But yes, go for it.
But here's the thing is that I have always been kind of frightened of dogs. And this is a story about how writing can change the writer. I've always been kind of scared of dogs and grew up with dogs being very much working animals and watchdogs and, slathering great hounds. So I just found them frightening and didn't ever want to have a dog. But Gelman arrived in this novel and he was safe because he was, made out of ink, and I wrote my way into feeling that dogs were kind of a good thing, to the point that I'm the proud owner of a doodle, not a Gelman type of animal, but a very fastidious young doodle. And I just wanted to bring that up because I feel like writing changed me. All the novels that I've written and all the books that I've written have changed me. But this one is something very material that, to the great delight of my children, changed me into a dog lover.
And that's the little dog in your acknowledgements then, because
Yes.
I was wondering if that's the dog that inspired Gelman, but it was the opposite.
It was the opposite, most things with me are opposites. It seems like it would be one way, but no.
That's very cool. So are you a writer that, finishes the full catastrophe, or it's put to bed, it's ready to go, and you just move on to another project? Or do you just take some time to sort of, enjoy it, take a breath, sort of catch up on life, and then sort of wait for or look for inspiration, I guess, as it were, before sort of diving into another project? I mean, you also write poetry, so I imagine that probably your creative sort of path flows back and forth through both on a pretty regular basis.
Well, I wish I was the kind of writer who I've only actually ever heard of someone. I feel like we're quite a neurotic bunch, and that, for me anyway, like I don't feel sane or healthy unless I'm writing. So, but I mean, a novel's a big project. So I'm not, and it's something you have to work your way into. It's something that you have to write your way into a sense of conviction. And so no, I'm not working on another novel, but I'm certainly writing. And I mean, it's what I do. So I wouldn't feel healthy or sane if I wasn't writing. But it's not really anything that I wish that it was, as you say, that I've wove my way between different genres in a great.
Well, it's probably muscle memory as much as anything, right? Where you've got to keep you've got to keep working out or practicing or whatever you want to call it, even if it's not something that comes to any sort of fruition. And I would never, I always like to sort of ask writers what they're working on next, but I would never dare, ask for specifics, because I've heard so many, writers say, oh, I had 200 pages and I put it in a desk drawer and it's never going to see the light of day ever again. So, like inadvertently give away the plot, or you give a hint for something that is just never going to be. So, well, I really appreciate all of your insight about this book, Meira. And Chris, did you have anything else?
No, I was just going to, it made me think of, I think it's Mordecai Richler that said you have to put in the work so that when inspiration hits, you're ready to go and you can take advantage of it. Something like that, at least.
That's very good.
Yeah. That's wonderful.
Yes.
Yeah.
He's like, he was one of the writers that I loved so much and have read everything he's written, and really is dear to me. When I was coming to Canada, I knew two Canadian writers, Mordecai Richler and Mazo de la Roche. And I don't know if anyone reads Mazo de la Roche, but I still do, and I love her writing. And I think those two writers would have hated each other, but I love them both.
Mordecai Richler came to the store and we were so disappointed because he treated us so well. He had such a reputation.
Wonderful.
I know, he was a wonderful person.
He was warm and charming.
Yeah.
My theory about, because of course I was there, this was Barney's version. And My theory is that he sees Winnipeg as the beloved place that we like. It's not a place of pretension. And I think his whole shtick is like puncturing pretension. But then I was in the queue waiting for him to sign my book, and there were old Jewish men asking him in front of me. They were saying, "Well, do you have a lift home? Do you have a jacket? What are you going to wear? Do you have a jacket? This is really cold out there."
That's great. Man, well, I'm trying to think if there was anything else. Meira, is there anything you wanted to talk about before we sort of wrap things up here? I mean, you've been a very gracious and wonderful guest. So
I would like to know what you guys think of Jules, because Jules is Charlie's mother, and a lot of readers have taken against Jules and felt that she was kind of monstrous, and wasn't a good mother, and she does do something quite awful, which I won't go into, but I was interested in, do you find her a bad mother, a terrible person?
I have tentative feelings about Jules. I hesitate a bit. I was trying to, because there is that kind of gut response to think of her as a bad mother and so on, but she has her own stuff going on, and so in a novel, I think what I like about reading novels is you get to suspend all the judgments. They're not real people you have to throw in jail. You don't have to finalize judgment. So I find myself suspending judgment with characters, trying to kind of explore what they might be, what might cause them to be the way they are. So
that's a really good way of seeing it. Thank you. You're right. Like, no, they're characters in a novel. We don't have to make
nope.
Yeah, I love that explanation as well. I thought the ways in which her character was revealed throughout the book were really fascinating too. I mean, sort of near the beginning, the email, the very feisty emails with Charlie's teacher back and forth, and these arguments. I actually, they were combative, and I felt for the teacher a little bit, but at the same time, I was like, oh, I love where this is going, and at times it was to me the mark of an extremely well-written, thought-out character was just that there are parts of them you can love and parts of them you can loathe, and Jules for me was that character, and like Chris said, with struggles of her own, but just doing what she could with what she could, and still trying to retain her artistic output, and yeah.
Thank you. Yes, I shall go forward with that.
Right.
You could do a real plot twist, and instead of doing a sequel about Charlie, you could do a sequel about Jules.
Oh.
Anyway, you have lots of fodder to work with coming out of this meeting, I guess, or nothing.
Well, thank you all so much for that amazing discussion. Really enjoyed it. Enjoyed the book so much. I forgot to do our land acknowledgement at the beginning of the meeting, and because it's such an important part of the meeting, I would like to do that now. So we are joining you from Winnipeg, which is Treaty 1 territory, the traditional land of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dene, and Dakota people, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. Next month, we are doing Hey Good Luck Out There by Georgia Taves. Yes, she is the daughter of Miriam. I'm really looking forward to this book. I believe Jen Zarate is coming to host next month's meeting, because she hosted the launch at McNally. So her and Georgia already have a bit of a rapport, so that should be really fun. You'll get an email with more information about this book tomorrow morning. And that's pretty much it for us. So thank you again, Ben and Chris and Meira, of course. Thank you all for watching, and we will see you again next month.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.